It is 1150 BC in the Argolid plain of southern Greece. The wind sweeps through the open gates of a citadel that once commanded the entire valley, whistling past massive limestone blocks that no longer guard anything but dust. Silence hangs heavy over the stone courtyards where merchants, scribes and soldiers used to shout over the noise of wooden carts and lowing cattle, a stillness that feels permanent and heavy. In our world of constant hum and digital signals, it is hard to imagine a quiet so profound, where the only sound is the rustle of dry weeds against ancient masonry and the distant call of a hawk circling a deserted tower. Now lower the lights, let the room grow calm, and together, let's step into today's story. To understand the magnitude of this silence, we must first picture the noise that came before it. For centuries, this place was not merely a residence for a king or a fortress for war. It was a massive beating heart of commerce and sustenance. We often think of ancient palaces as places of luxury, filled with gold cups and woven tapestries, and indeed they were. But at their foundation, they were warehouses. They were the grocery stores, the banks, and the distribution centres for thousands of people living in the shadow of the walls. The economy was a centralised machine, a great wheel that turned with the seasons, and everyone, from the shepherd on the hillside to the potter at his wheel, relied on its rotation. Imagine walking into the deep, cool storage rooms of this complex just a few decades earlier. The air would have been thick with the smell of olive oil and raw wool. Rows of massive clay jars, some as tall as a person, stood like silent sentinels, filled to the brim with grain, wine, and oil. These were the reserves of the state. Farmers from the surrounding valley did not simply grow food for themselves, they brought their harvest here. They surrendered their surplus to the palace officials, and in return the palace promised stability. It promised that when winter came, or when a drought dried the fields, the rations would be distributed back to the people. It was a social contract written in wheat and barley. But now the jars are broken. Shards of pottery crunch underfoot, scattered across the stone floors like bones. The grain that once filled them has long since been eaten, stolen or burned. The system of redistribution, which had operated with clockwork precision for generations, has shattered. In the administrative wing of the palace, the evidence of this sudden stop remains frozen in time. Here, the scribes worked, pressing reeds into damp clay to keep track of every litre of oil and every head of sheep. It is a strange irony of history that the very disaster that destroyed this civilization is what preserved its memory. The scribes wrote on unbaked clay tablets, which were meant to be temporary records, recycled and smoothed over at the end of a fiscal year. They were never intended to last for centuries. However, when the great fires swept through these citadels, fires that marked the end of the age, the heat was so intense that it baked the clay hard, turning temporary notes into permanent stone. These accidental ceramics give us a haunting glimpse into the final days. They are not filled with poetry or grand declarations of war. Instead, they are mundane lists. They tally the frantic collection of bronze from local temples to make weapons. They list the watchers sent to the coast to scan the horizon for enemy sails. They record the rations given to women and children, and then the records simply stop. There is no final entry explaining what happened. There is only the silence that follows. Historians still argue whether it was a foreign invasion that lit the match, a series of catastrophic earthquakes, or perhaps an internal uprising by a populace tired of high taxes and hunger. But for the people standing in the ashes, the cause mattered far less than the result. The complex network that moved food from the farm to the storehouse and back to the village was gone. Think of the shock of that realization. It would be similar to walking to your local market tomorrow and finding not only the shelves empty, but the building itself abandoned, with no trucks coming to restock it. The specialized knowledge of the palace scribes, who knew exactly how much grain was needed to feed 1,000 people for a winter, vanished overnight. The central authority that organized the planting and the harvest was no more. In the immediate aftermath, the valley floor is a place of confusion. The smoke has cleared, but the uncertainty has settled in like a fog. The survivors are left with a terrifying freedom. There is no king to demand a portion of their harvest, which might seem like a relief at first. But there is also no king to open the granary doors when the crops fail. The safety net has been cut away. You can imagine a farmer standing by his field, looking up at the blackened ruin on the hill. For his entire life, and for the lives of his father and grandfather, that hill was the centre of the world. It was the source of authority and protection. Now, it is just a pile of rocks. He holds a handful of seed grain, perhaps saved from the chaos, and realizes that the old rules no longer apply. He cannot count on the large-scale irrigation channels the palace engineers maintained. He cannot count on the trade routes that brought in copper and tin. He is entirely alone. This is the beginning of a darker, quieter time, but also a time of intense human resilience. The breakdown of the great distribution centres forces a sudden local self-reliance. Neighbours must rely on neighbours. There is no distant capital to send aid. The radius of their world shrinks from the span of the Mediterranean Sea to the distance a person can walk in a day. The tools of survival must change. The crops they choose to grow must be hardier, less reliant on the complex infrastructure of the past. The way they store their food must become more secretive, more personal. They can no longer store their wealth in giant jars in a central hall, for that would just be an invitation to raiders. They must learn to hide their harvest, to hoard it in small batches, to protect it with their own hands. The grand complexity of the Bronze Age, with its international trade and specialized industries, is peeling away, revealing the raw, fundamental need to eat. The people are not just losing a government, they are losing the very structure of their daily lives. The sun still rises over the Arglid, heating the rocky soil, but the human landscape has been altered forever. The age of the palace is over. The age of the village, the farmstead, and the isolated household has begun. But as the plains below the ruined citadels become dangerous, pathways for wandering bandits and desperate refugees, staying in the open valley becomes a risk that few are willing to take. If the fertile lowlands are no longer safe, and the Great Walls offer no more protection, where does a family go to plant the seeds of a new future? The answer lies in the jagged silhouette of the horizon. If you were to stand in the silent courtyard of a fallen palace and lift your eyes, you would see the peaks of the surrounding mountains cutting into the blue sky. To the modern eye, these highlands might look like desolate, uninhabitable crags, places for hiking or perhaps grazing a few goats, but certainly not for building a town. Yet for the families watching their civilization unravel in the valleys below, these inhospitable slopes offer the one thing the fertile lowlands have lost: security. The migration is not a swift, organized march. It is a slow, ragged trickle of humanity moving upward. Imagine the scene as a family packs what remains of their lives. They cannot take everything. The heavy furniture, the decorative pottery, and the large looms are left behind in the abandoned farmhouses of the plain. Instead, they carry only what is essential: seeds, simple tools, heavy woolen cloaks, and perhaps a small, coarse icon of a household god tucked into a pouch. They walk away from the soft soil of the riverbanks and begin the steep climb onto the limestone spines of the land. As they ascend, the air changes. The heavy, humid heat of the valley gives way to a thinner, sharper breeze. The vegetation shifts from the broad leaves of the marsh plants to the prickly scrub of the hillside. Thyme, sage, and resilient oak. This is a landscape of the grey stone and green scrub, exposed to the elements. It is here, on these remote pinnacles, that they stop and begin to build. Archaeologists call these new homes refuge settlements, a name that perfectly captures their purpose. These are not cities designed for commerce or display. They are hideouts. People are trading comfort for survival, choosing to live on sheer cliffs where the only approach is a narrow, winding goat path that can be easily defended by a handful of men with rocks and spears. The architecture reflects this new reality. In the valley, houses were often freestanding, separated by gardens or lanes. Here, space is at a premium. The buildings cluster together tightly, like barnacles clinging to a rock face. They share walls, forming a continuous barrier against the wind that howls through the mountain passes. The streets are not the wide, paved avenues of the Mycenaean citadels, wide enough for a chariot. Instead, they are narrow, twisting alleyways, often no wider than a person's shoulders, paved with rough cobblestones. This layout serves a dual purpose. It breaks the force of the biting winter gales, and it turns the village itself into a maze that would confuse any raider foolish enough to attack. Life in these highland villages is harder, grittier. Water, once easily drawn from river channels or deep palace wells, becomes a precious, heavy burden. Women and children must walk long distances to natural springs, carrying jars of water back up the steep slopes every single day. The ease of the plain is a fading memory, replaced by the daily physical exertion of merely existing. One fascinating detail of these homes is how they integrate with the mountain itself. Builders in these times often do not bother to level the ground completely. Instead, they incorporate the natural bedrock into their living spaces. A protruding ledge of limestone might serve as a bench, a shelf for oil lamps, or even the base of a sleeping platform. It is a humble, practical architecture where the house and the mountain are fused together. There is something deeply grounding about this, living in a home where the floor is the very bone of the earth, unshaped by human hands. Historians still argue whether these moves to the highlands were purely defensive reactions to violence or a rejection of the old palace hierarchy. Some scholars suggest that moving to the mountains was also a way to escape the suffocating taxation and control of the failing states. Up here, amidst the clouds and the eagles, a community is free to govern itself. There are no scribes to count their sheep. There are no tax collectors to demand a portion of their grain. It is a harsh freedom, but freedom nonetheless. In these tight-knit communities, the social distance shrinks. In the old world, the king was a distant figure, seen only during festivals or processions. In the refuge settlement, the leader lives next door. You can smell his cooking fire, you can hear his children playing in the alley. The hierarchy flattens. Survival depends on cooperation, on the shared warmth of the village. If a wall crumbles, the neighbours help rebuild it. If a family runs low on barley, others share what they have. The isolation from the outside world fosters a fierce internal loyalty. From their high vantage points, these people become watchers. They can look down into the valleys they left behind, seeing the smoke of campfires from wandering bands or the empty shells of the great towns. There is a melancholy in this view, a daily reminder of what was lost. They are the survivors of an apocalypse, clinging to the edge of the world, keeping the flame of their culture alive in the thin mountain air. Yet despite the safety of the heights, a creeping anxiety begins to set in. The move to the mountains has severed the old trade routes. The complex network that brought materials from far away has dissolved. For generations, the tools of their lives, the sickles that harvested the grain, the axes that felled the timber, the knives that butchered the meat, were made of bronze. Bronze is an alloy, a marriage of copper and tin. Copper can be found in the nearby hills, but tin is a traveller. It comes from distant lands, brought by ships that no longer sail and merchants who no longer walk the roads. As the years pass in the high settlements, the village smiths look at their stockpiles with growing dread. The old bronze tools are being sharpened and resharpened until they are worn down to nubbins. Broken blades are melted down and recast, the metal recycled again and again until it becomes brittle and weak. A crisis of material is approaching. The soft, golden age of bronze is fading, and the mountain stone is unforgiving. They are safe from raiders, and they have roofs over their heads, but how can they carve a future out of this hard, rocky wilderness when the very metal that builds their world is disappearing day by day? The crisis of the empty storehouse is frightening, but the crisis of the forge is existential. Without metal, the capacity to cut wood, shear sheep, or defend the village slowly evaporates. In the high refuge settlements, the village blacksmith becomes a figure of intense scrutiny and pressure. For years he has been a worker of bronze, a master of mixing molten copper with rare, imported tin to create the golden-hued alloy that defined the age. Bronze is a cooperative metal. When heated, it turns to liquid, flowing obediently into clay moulds to create axes, spearheads and sickles with smooth, perfect edges. But as the trade networks disintegrate and the ships stop arriving, the tin supply dries up completely. The smith is left with only copper, which is too soft to hold an edge, and a growing pile of broken, useless tools. Necessity, as they say, is the mother of invention, but in the Dark Ages, necessity is a harsh and demanding parent. The solution to the metal shortage lies right beneath their feet in the reddish, rusty earth of the mountains. Iron ore is abundant. It is everywhere. Unlike tin, you do not need to sail to the ends of the earth to find it. You just need to dig. But for a Bronze Age smith, iron is a nightmare. It is a stubborn, difficult material that refuses to behave like the metals he knows. Imagine standing in the smoky, cramped workshop of one of these early iron pioneers. The heat here is different, more intense, more consuming. To work iron, the smith must build a hotter fire than he has ever built before, requiring vast amounts of charcoal. He constructs a bloomery, a chimney-like furnace made of clay, and feeds it with layers of crushed ore and charcoal. He pumps the bellows until his arms ache, driving the temperature up, waiting for the metal to liquefy. But it never does. This is the frustrating secret of iron. In these ancient furnaces, it does not melt, it does not pour. After hours of intense labour, the smith breaks open the clay furnace to find not a puddle of liquid metal, but a glowing, spongy lump of red-hot matter mixed with slag and ash. It looks like a mistake. It looks like a failure. To turn this ugly, porous bloom into a tool, he must treat it with a violence unknown in bronze working. He drags the glowing lump to the anvil and begins to hammer it. He must beat the impurities out of the metal, folding it, heating it, hammering it again, over and over. The rhythmic clang, clang, clang of the iron hammer becomes the new heartbeat of the village, a sharper, harder sound than the dull thud of bronze casting. This transition is not a moment of triumphant discovery. It is a long, sweaty struggle against physics. The first iron tools are actually inferior to the old bronze ones. They are softer, prone to bending, and they rust quickly, turning back into the earth from which they came. A bronze sword could last for generations. An early iron knife might rot away in a few wet winters. Yet it is available. It is the democratic metal, accessible to anyone willing to put in the back-breaking labour to extract it. There is a fascinating, quirky tidbit about this shift in value. In the centuries prior, iron was known, but it was almost exclusively sky iron, metal harvested from fallen meteorites. It was rare, magical, and used only for the jewellery of kings, often considered more precious than gold. Now, in the grit of the Dark Ages, this divine material is being dragged down to the mud. It is being demystified, turned from a celestial rarity into the material of the hoe and the ploughshare. The divine has become the daily grind. Historians still argue whether the spread of ironworking technology was a result of diffusion, knowledge passed slowly from the Hittite Empire in the east, or if it was a case of independent invention, sparked simultaneously in different places by the universal collapse of the tin trade. Did refugees bring the secret with them? Or did desperate smiths in isolated villages stumble upon the chemistry of carbon and iron through trial and error? We may never know for sure, but the archaeological record shows a patchwork of experimentation. Some villages mastered it quickly, others clung to their dwindling bronze scraps for decades. As you watch the smith working in the twilight, sparks flying like captured stars, you can sense the shift in the era. The smooth, golden aesthetics of the Bronze Age are gone. The Iron Age is grey, black and rough. The tools that emerge from the forge are not beautiful. They are pitted and scarred from the hammer. But as the smith learns to quench the hot iron in water, tempering it, he discovers something profound. This ugly metal is strong. It is harder than bronze. It can hold an edge that bites deep. This strength is crucial because the environment the refugees now inhabit is unforgiving. The soft, alluvial soils of the river valleys are far below. Here, on the slopes, the earth is rocky and steep. A bronze plough would snap against the hidden boulders of the highlands. But an iron share, an iron pickaxe, these tools can attack the mountain itself. They can break the grip of the stones. The psychological impact of this transition must have been immense. For the villagers, it meant that their survival was no longer tethered to the whims of distant empires or foreign merchants. They had severed the umbilical cord of the global economy. As long as they had trees for charcoal and red earth for ore, they could make the tools they needed. It was a declaration of independence written in sparks and soot. The smith wipes the soot from his forehead, looking at the cooling blade on the anvil. It is dark, heavy, and lethal. It represents a new kind of power, the power of the local, the power of the resilient. He hands the finished tool to a farmer waiting by the door. The farmer tests the weight of it, feeling the balance. It is different, lacking the grace of the old ways, but it feels substantial. It feels like a tool meant for work, not for show. This iron blade is the key that unlocks the next chapter of their survival. With this harder, tougher metal in hand, the refugees can finally turn their attention to the daunting landscape around them. They have the will to survive, and now they have the means to shape the earth. But looking at the sheer vertical slopes of their new mountain home, a question remains. Even with iron tools to break the ground, how can they possibly stop the soil from washing away into the abyss with the first heavy rain? The iron pickaxe strikes the ground, ringing out with a sharp, clear tone that echoes off the canyon walls. It bites into the rocky slope, levering out a limestone boulder the size of a sheep. A man grunts with the effort, his hands wrapped in rough leather, sweat cutting tracks through the dust on his face. He is standing on a hillside so steep that if he were to lose his footing, he might tumble all the way down to the dry riverbed below. Yet it is here, on this precarious slant, that the community has decided to stake its future. The problem they face is gravity. In the Mediterranean, the rains do not come as a gentle year-round drizzle. They arrive in the winter, often in fierce torrential storms that turn dry gullies into raging torrents. On the flat plains of the Old Kingdom, the water pooled and soaked into the deep earth. But here, on the mountain flanks, the water is a thief. It rushes downhill, taking the precious topsoil with it, leaving behind only bare, sterile rock. To farm here is to fight a war against the rain. The solution is an architectural marvel that will come to define the landscape for the next 3,000 years. The terrace. If the mountain refuses to give them flat land, they will build it themselves, step by stone step. This is not work that can be done quickly. It is a slow, agonizing process of rearranging the geology of the hillside. The families work together, forming human chains to pass smaller stones up the slope. They are building walls, but these are not walls to keep enemies out or livestock in. These are retaining walls designed to hold back the earth itself. The technique they use is known as dry stone masonry. There is no mortar here, no cement to glue the rocks together. Instead, the strength of the wall comes from the friction and gravity of the stones themselves. It is a giant, three-dimensional puzzle. The builder must choose each rock with care, finding the exact shape that will lock into its neighbours. A round stone is useless. A flat, angular stone is a prize. They fit them together so tightly that not even a knife blade can slide between them. There is a specific, almost hidden genius in how these walls are constructed. If you were to take one apart, you would find that the face of the wall is just the skin. Behind the visible stones, the builders pack a layer of loose rubble, gravel, small pebbles, and even shards of broken pottery from the ruined palaces. This layer is crucial. It acts as a filter. When the heavy rains come, the water flows through the soil, hits the rubble, and trickles harmlessly out through the cracks in the wall. If the wall were solid and watertight, the pressure of the sodden earth behind it would eventually burst the stone, causing a landslide. By allowing the wall to breathe and weep water, they ensure it will stand for centuries. It is a quirky, often overlooked detail of this era that the very debris of their collapse becomes the foundation of their new life. A shattered wine jar, once a symbol of trade and luxury, is now smashed further and used as drainage fill behind a terrace wall. The past literally supports the present. As the walls rise, they transform the chaotic, sloping wilderness into a series of orderly, flat ribbons. The mountain begins to look like a giant staircase ascending to the sky. Behind each wall, the farmers backfill the space with soil, carefully carrying dirt in baskets from sediment traps in the valley or scraping it from the forest floor. It is an act of supreme patience. They are manufacturing farmland where none existed. Historians still argue whether this massive landscaping effort was organised by a central leader, a local big man or chieftain trying to replicate the order of the palaces, or if it was a purely organic communal evolution where families simply copied the success of their neighbours. Did a master builder direct the angle of the walls, or did the collective wisdom of the village learn to read the slope through trial and error? The variation in styles from one valley to the next suggests the latter, a grassroots innovation born of desperation. The atmosphere on the hillside during this construction is one of forward rhythmic exertion. There is the heavy breathing of men lifting rocks, the scrape of stone on stone, and the occasional shout of warning as a rock slips. But there is also a sense of triumph. With every finished level, they create a microclimate. The stone walls absorb the heat of the sun during the day and radiate it back into the soil at night, keeping the frost at bay. The terraces trap moisture, keeping the earth damp long after the rains have stopped. They have turned a hostile environment into an incubator. Imagine standing at the bottom of the valley and looking up. Where there was once only grey scrub and dangerous scree, there are now bands of green hugging the contours of the land. It is a visual representation of order imposed on chaos. These stairs of stone are the fingerprint of the Dark Ages. They are not grand monuments like the pyramids or the lion-guarded gates of Mycenae. They are humble, functional, and ubiquitous. Yet they represent a greater localized labor investment than even the greatest tombs of the kings. This work also changes the relationship between the people and the land. In the flat plains, a farmer might plough a large square field and never touch the soil with his hands. Here, the farmer knows every stone in the wall. He knows which one wiggles when he steps on it. He knows which section needs repair after a storm. The land is not just a possession. It is a crafted object, maintained with the same care one might give to a roof or a tool. But as the terraces are finished and the fresh dark soil is levelled out behind the stone barriers, a new problem arises. The strips of land are narrow, sometimes only a few meters wide. They are difficult to plough with oxen. The soil is shallow and heats up quickly in the blistering summer sun. The staple crops of the old world, the vast fields of water-hungry wheat that fed the armies of the kings, are ill-suited for these narrow baking ledges. Wheat is fragile. It needs depth and consistent moisture. If they plant wheat here, a single dry month could kill the entire harvest, and the village would starve. The farmers stand on their beautiful new stone stairs, dusting the dirt from their hands, looking at the narrow ribbons of earth they have created. They have built the perfect structure, but they need a different kind of engine to drive it. They need a crop that is as tough as the people themselves, something that actually prefers the rocky, calcareous soil, something that can withstand the scorching heat and the lack of water. They need a plant that can take the sunlight hitting these stone walls and turn it into something dense, durable, and life-sustaining. On those narrow sun-baked terraces, where the soil is too shallow for the deep roots of wheat and the sun is too fierce for the tender leaves of barley, a different kind of life begins to take hold. It is a tree that seems designed by nature specifically for this hard, rocky age. The olive tree does not ask for much. It does not demand the constant irrigation of the river valley or the pampered care of a palace garden. In fact, it seems to thrive on struggle. Its roots are like iron cables, twisting and worming their way into the cracks of the limestone, finding moisture deep within the heart of the mountain where no other plant can reach. As the years of the Great Silence stretch on, the hillsides around the refuge settlements undergo a transformation. The grey of the rock is softened by the shimmering silver-green canopy of the olive groves. This tree becomes the silent partner of the refugee. It is a long-term pact. An olive tree planted by a father might not reach its full potential until his son is an old man. Planting one is an act of supreme faith in the future, a declaration that we are staying here and our children will stay here. When late autumn arrives, bringing with it the cool winds from the north, the harvest begins. This is not a task for a solitary farmer. It is a community event that pulls every family member out of their stone houses and onto the terraces. The method is ancient and rhythmic. Men and boys climb into the gnarled branches or stand on the walls, wielding long wooden poles. They strike the branches, not with anger, but with a practiced rhythmic beat. Thwack, thwack, thwack. The sound echoes across the valley, a percussion drum of survival. Below, women and children scramble over the rocky ground, gathering the fallen fruit, their fingers stained dark purple by the juice. The processing of this fruit is where the true ingenuity of the village shines. The olive fresh from the tree is inedible, bitter and hard. To unlock its value, it must be transformed. In the corner of a courtyard, or perhaps in a shared village shed, stands the press. It is a simple machine far removed from the complex hydraulics of the modern world, yet perfectly effective. A heavy round stone carved from the local volcanic rock is rolled over the olives in a basin, crushing the flesh and the pits into a thick black paste. This paste is then scooped into woven baskets, stacked one on top of the other, like a tower of dark cheeses. A heavy wooden beam anchored into the wall is lowered onto the stack. Weighted down with large stones, the beam presses down and slowly the magic happens. A liquid begins to weep from the baskets. It runs down into a settling tank, a mixture of water and oil. There is a moment of quiet anticipation as they wait for physics to do its work. Slowly the golden oil rises to the top, floating above the bitter vegetable water. This floating layer is skimmed off with reverence. It is not just food, it is energy in its purest form. In a world where calories are hard to catch, where hunting is uncertain and grain harvests can fail, olive oil is a miracle. It is a condensed battery of nutrition. A splash of oil on a piece of rough barley bread can sustain a worker for hours. It provides the fat that the human brain desperately needs, replacing the meat that has become a rarity on the dinner table. But the liquid gold is far more than just a meal. It is the Swiss Army knife of the ancient household. In the dim, windowless rooms of the stone houses, the sun sets early. The darkness of the pre-electric world is absolute and suffocating. But with a small clay bowl, a pinch of moss or a twist of linen for a wick, and a reservoir of olive oil, the family can push back the night. The flame is steady and gentle, smelling faintly of the earth. It allows a mother to weave in the evening. It allows a grandfather to tell stories to the children. The oil grants them the gift of time. There is also a fascinating, intimate use of this oil that speaks to the daily hygiene of the people. We often think of bathing in terms of water and soap, But in these water-scarce highlands, wasting a bucket of water to wash the body is an unthinkable luxury. Instead, the ancients use oil. They rub the golden liquid into their skin, letting it mix with the dust and sweat of the day's labour. Then, using a curved bronze or iron tool called a strigil, they scrape the oil off, taking the dirt with it. It leaves the skin clean, moisturised and protected against the harsh mountain wind. In a very real sense, the farmer wears the harvest of his trees. Historians still argue whether the intensification of olive cultivation in this period was a state-directed enterprise that survived the collapse, or if it was a purely grassroots adaptation by the free peasantry. Did the kings plant the first great groves, or did the refugees realise that the olive was the only crop that could survive the neglect of the times? The evidence suggests that while the palaces valued oil, the true explosion of olive culture happened when people were forced onto the marginal lands where nothing else would grow. It was the landscape itself that dictated the economy. However, the production of oil yields a strange byproduct. When the oil is separated, a dark, watery, bitter sludge remains at the bottom of the settling tank. This dregs, known to the Romans later as a murca, is toxic to plants and foul to taste. Yet nothing is wasted in the economy of scarcity. The villagers discover that the bitter fluid is a potent weed killer. They pour it on the threshing floors to keep the grass from growing through the cracks. They use it to treat leather and to seal wood against rot. Even the waste of the olive serves the household. As the winter sets in, the storage jars in the back of the house begin to fill. These are not the giant palace-sized jars of the past, but smaller manageable vessels. The oil inside them is a form of currency. It does not rot like fruit. It does not mould like grain. If sealed properly, it lasts. It can be traded with a coastal village for salt, or with a wandering smith for iron. It is liquid wealth, stable and universally valued. The reliance on the olive changes the flavour of the culture. It moves them away from the immediate hand-to-mouth existence of the hunter-gatherer and anchors them to a specific place. You cannot carry an olive grove on your back. To be an olive farmer is to make a pact with the land to stay, to defend and to endure. The twisted trunks of the trees, some of which will outlive the stone walls they grow beside, become the silent witnesses to the generations that toil beneath them. The village is now fed, and its nights are lit by the golden oil. The terraces are holding the soil, and the olive trees are holding the terraces. But man cannot live by bread and oil alone. There is another thirst that haunts the dry throat of the summer, a need for something that does more than hydrate, something that purifies the water and lifts the spirit in a world that has grown small and hard. The olive conquers the hunger. But what of the thirst? And how does the other great vine of the Mediterranean survive the climb into the cold hills? Beside the silver grey of the olive trees, another plant clings to the terraced walls, offering a starker contrast in colour and temperament. The grapevine is the wilder, more chaotic sibling of the disciplined olive. While the olive tree stands firm and upright, waiting patiently for decades, the vine is a creature of speed and aggression. Left to its own devices, it will sprawl across the rocky ground, climbing over stones and choking out the scrub brush in a frantic race for the sun. In these highland settlements, the farmer must become a strict disciplinarian. Every winter, when the vines are dormant and look like dead twisted snakes, the villagers take their iron knives to them, cutting them back until almost nothing remains. It is a harsh pruning and necessary violence to force the plant to put its energy into fruit rather than leaves. In the heat of the late summer, just before the olives are ready, the vineyards come alive. The clusters of grapes hang heavy and low, protected from the scorching noon sun by the canopy of broad green leaves. This is a dangerous time for the crop. The sugar content in the fruit is rising, and the air is filled with the sweet, heavy scent of ripening fruit. This scent is a siren call to every wasp, bird, and wild boar in the mountains. The villagers must be vigilant, sometimes sleeping in makeshift huts in the fields to scare away thieves, both animal and human. The harvest itself, the vintage, is perhaps the most sensory-intense moment of the agricultural year. If the olive harvest is a rhythmic beating, the grape harvest is a sticky, frantic gathering. The fruit is delicate. It cannot be knocked down with poles. It must be cut by hand, cluster by cluster. The juice stains the fingers and clothes, drawing swarms of bees that hover around the workers' heads. There is a sense of urgency here that does not exist with the olive or the grain. Once the grape is picked, the clock starts ticking. It begins to degrade immediately, the skin breaking, the wild yeasts on the surface already beginning their work. The processing of the grapes takes place in treading vats, often carved directly into the bedrock of the mountain or built from sturdy limestone slabs plastered with waterproof lime. This is one of the few times in history where the human foot becomes the primary tool of industry. The sensation is singular, the cool, yielding pop of the berries, the squelch of the skins, the rising tide of juice that chills the ankles even as the sun beats down on the shoulders. It is a communal rhythm, a shared labour that requires balance and stamina. But the true mystery happens after the treading. In the dark, cool silence of the storage jars, the juice or must is poured into large clay vessels, and there, in the darkness, it begins to boil without fire. To the ancient mind, this must have seemed like a possession. The liquid churns and froths, releasing a gas that can suffocate a man if he lingers too long in a sealed room. It is the spirit of the wine waking up. This fermentation is not just about creating alcohol for the sake of intoxication. In the ancient world, and particularly in these times of collapsed infrastructure, alcohol is a survival tool. The water sources in the mountains, while cleaner than the stagnant rivers of the plains, are still unpredictable. A dead sheep upstream or a wash of sediment can turn a spring into a source of sickness. Wine is the solution. It is rarely drunk straight. That would be considered barbaric and wasteful. Instead, it is mixed with water, usually in a ratio of 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part wine. The alcohol kills the bacteria, making the water safe to drink. In a very real sense, the wine cellar is the village's water purification plant. However, keeping the wine from turning into vinegar is a constant battle. The enemies are air and heat. The jars, once the violent fermentation has settled, must be sealed tight. But here lies a quirky sensory detail of the age. Cork is not yet the standard stopper. Instead, the villagers turn to the pine forests that grow on the higher peaks. They harvest the sticky, fragrant resin from the trees and use it to coat the inside of the jars and to seal the lids. This necessity creates a flavour profile that would be shocking to a modern palate. The wine of the Dark Ages does not just taste of fruit and earth. It tastes powerfully of the forest. It carries the sharp turpentine tang of pine resin. This practical solution, using tree sap to preserve the vintage, eventually becomes a cultural preference, surviving today in the form of Greek retsina. For the ancient refugee, the taste of wine is inextricably linked to the smell of the pine trees that shelter their homes. Historians still argue about the social role of wine in these reduced communities. In the great palaces of the past, wine was a marker of status, served in gold cups at exclusive feasts for the elite. Some scholars believe that in the Dark Ages, wine became a great equalizer. With the kings gone, the symposium, the gathering of men to drink and talk, moved from the throne room to the village square. It became a way for the local farmers to bond, to resolve disputes, and to reinforce the solidarity of the group. The cup was passed from hand to hand, dissolving the old hierarchies with every sip. There is also a deep mythological connection that anchors the people during these uncertain times. The vine is a plant that appears to die every winter, shrivelling into dry, brittle wood, only to be miraculously reborn in the spring. For a people living in the shadow of a collapsed civilization, this cycle is a powerful symbol of hope. It tells them that life can return from the brink of death, that a dry stick can bring forth sweet fruit. But the wine is also a commodity of trade. Even in the fractured world of the Dark Ages, a jar of good wine sealed with pine pitch is a form of currency that can travel. It might be strapped to the back of a donkey and carried over the mountain pass to a coastal village, exchanged for dried fish or precious salt. It is a way to store the sunlight of the summer and trade it in the depth of winter. The storage of these jars requires a cool, stable temperature. The villagers dig deep into the floors of their houses, burying the pointed bottoms of the amphorae in the cool earth, or they utilize natural caves in the limestone cliffs. These caves, smelling of damp stone and pine resin, become the archives of the harvest. Walking into one, holding a flickering oil lamp, a farmer can see the rows of clay rims protruding from the ground, a reassuring inventory of calories and hydration. Yet despite the ingenuity of the olive press and the wine vat, there is a limit to what these luxuries can provide. You can survive on oil and wine for a time, but they do not fill the belly in the way that truly matters. They are the accompaniments to a meal, not the meal itself. The true anchor of the diet, the heavy starchy fuel that drives the human engine, is grain. But grain is bulky. It is attractive to rats, moisture, and, most dangerously, to the hungry eyes of raiding parties passing through the valley. A field of wheat is impossible to hide. It stands golden and waving in the sun, a beacon to anyone watching from the ridges. Once harvested, the sheer volume of the grain presents a massive security risk. In the days of the palace, it was piled high in guarded towers. Now, with no walls and no guards, the farmers face a terrifying paradox. How do you store a year's worth of food without showing the world that you have it? To the casual observer walking through one of these highland villages in late autumn, the settlement would appear perilously poor. There are no silos towering over the rooftops, no guarded warehouses with heavy wooden doors, and no piles of sacks waiting in the courtyard. If a band of raiders were to sweep through the narrow streets, overturning baskets and kicking open the doors of the stone houses, they might find a small amount of daily flour, but the great bulk of the harvest seems to have vanished into thin air. The village appears to be living on the edge of starvation. This appearance of poverty is a carefully constructed illusion. The wealth of the village is right there, perhaps directly under the raiders' boots, sleeping silently in the dark. The solution to the problem of storing the harvest in dangerous times is the underground grain silo, or what archaeologists often call a bothros. This is not merely a hole dug in the ground. It is a sophisticated piece of engineering designed to trick both human enemies and the natural forces of decay. The construction of a silo begins with the pickaxe. The farmer chooses a spot, often inside the courtyard of the house, or sometimes, if the terrain allows, beneath the floor of the living room itself. They dig down through the topsoil into the firmer clay or bedrock below. The shape they carve is specific and intentional. It is not a simple cylinder. Instead, they dig a bottle or bell shape, narrow at the top like the neck of a flask, and widening out into a spacious chamber at the bottom. This shape serves a crucial structural purpose. The narrow opening is easy to cover and conceal. A single large flat stone dusted over with dirt and straw can make the entrance disappear completely. You could walk over your family's entire winter food supply without ever knowing it was there. But the design is also about chemistry, though the ancients understand it as the behaviour of the air and the earth. Before a single grain of wheat or barley is poured in, the interior must be prepared. The pit is often lined with straw, basketry, or even a layer of clay to create a barrier against the damp earth. Sometimes a fire is lit inside the empty pit to bake the walls dry and kill any lingering insects. Then comes the pouring. The threshing is done quickly, and the grain is rushed into the dark belly of the pit. As the chamber fills, the farmers trample the grain down, packing it tight to squeeze out as much air as possible. When it is full to the brim, they seal the narrow neck with clay and the heavy capstone, making it airtight. What happens next is a silent, invisible battle between the life of the grain and the pests that seek to destroy it. Inside the sealed pit, the grain continues to breathe for a short time, consuming the remaining oxygen in the tiny spaces between the kernels. At the same time, the natural respiration of the grain releases carbon dioxide. Within a few weeks, the atmosphere inside the pit changes completely. The oxygen level drops to near zero, and the carbon dioxide rises. This creates a lethal environment for weevils, beetles, and moth larvae, the great enemies of stored food. They simply suffocate. The grain puts itself into a state of suspended animation, a slumber induced by its own exhalations. It is a natural form of vacuum packing achieved centuries before the invention of plastic or electricity. There is a quirky, somewhat sacrificial aspect to this method that highlights the pragmatism of the time. The farmers know that they cannot keep the dampness of the earth out completely. The grain that touches the cool walls of the pit will inevitably absorb moisture and begin to mould. However, instead of ruining the whole batch, this outer layer forms a hard, crusty shell, a cake of spoiled grain about an inch thick. This crust acts as a final biological seal, protecting the pristine, dry heart of the store from the moisture of the soil. The spoilage is the shield. When the pit is eventually opened, this outer rind is chipped away and discarded, revealing the golden, healthy grain beneath. Opening a silo is a moment of high drama and subtle danger. When the capstone is pried up after months of storage, the air that rushes out is not fresh. It is heavy, sour, and deprived of oxygen. A person cannot simply jump in to shovel the grain out. The accumulated carbon dioxide could cause them to faint and suffocate within moments. The villagers know to let the pit breathe first, or they lower a lit lamp into the hole. If the flame flickers and dies, the air is still bad. If the flame burns bright, it is safe to enter. Historians still argue about the primary motivation behind these hidden pits. Was the shift to underground storage driven mainly by the fear of violence, a way to hide assets from the roving bands of the collapse? Or was it an agricultural adaptation to a changing climate? A way to preserve food for longer periods in a world where one bad harvest could mean extinction? The fact that these pits are so difficult to access, you cannot just scoop out a bowl of flour for lunch. You have to unseal the whole system, suggests they were used as long-term reserves, a bank account of calories to be touched only when absolutely necessary. This method of concealment changes the psychology of the village. Wealth is no longer something to be displayed, it is something to be buried. The status of a family is not determined by the size of their barn, but by the secret knowledge of what lies beneath their floorboards. It creates a culture of privacy and localized trust. A neighbor might know you have a pit, but they do not know exactly how deep it is or how full it stands. For the listener, imagine the feeling of security this provides. Outside, the winter wind howls and the news from the valley is full of unrest. But under your feet, beneath the stamped earth floor where your children are playing, lie 2 tons of barley, safe, silent, and sleeping. It is a grounding feeling, quite literally. The foundation of the home is the harvest itself. Yet this system has its limits. While grain provides the energy to work the fields and build the walls, the human body weakens without protein. In the golden age of the palaces, the diet was supplemented by beef from great herds of cattle that graze the lush, well-watered meadows of the lowlands. The cow is a magnificent animal, but it is also a demanding one. It requires vast amounts of water, flat, lush grass, and a peaceful, stable environment to thrive. It moves slowly and cannot climb the jagged limestone cliffs of the refuge settlements. As the refugees look out over their steep, rocky domain, they realize that the age of the cow has passed, just as the age of the chariot has passed. The landscape is too vertical, the water too scarce, and the scrub too thorny for the gentle giants of the plain. They need an animal that can eat thorns and drink from puddles, a creature that can scramble up a vertical wall and thrive on neglect. They need a beast that matches the roughness of the new world they inhabit. As the landscape shifts from the gentle rolling meadows of the past to the jagged vertical reality of the refuge settlements, the soundscape of the countryside changes with it. The deep, mournful lowing of cattle, a sound that once signified the wealth of the valley palaces, fades into silence. In its place rises a new chorus, higher pitched and more chaotic, the bleating of sheep and the sharp, inquisitive calls of goats. The transition from cattle to smaller livestock is not merely a change in diet. It is a fundamental restructuring of the economy to fit the harsh geometry of the mountains. The cow is a majestic engine of conversion, turning lush grass into vast quantities of milk and meat, but it is an engine that requires high maintenance. It needs flat ground, abundant water, and soft green fodder. If you try to herd a cow up a limestone cliff, you are fighting nature. But the goat is an acrobat. There is a deep respect for the goat in these highland communities. Born of necessity, it is the perfect machine for the dark ages. Where a cow sees a barren hillside of thorns, prickly oak, and dry scrub, a goat sees a banquet. These animals are browsers, not grazers. They do not need the delicate grasses of the valley. They can digest the tough, woody fibers that no other animal can eat. They can stand on their hind legs to strip the leaves from an olive branch. They can balance on a ledge no wider than a handbreadth to reach a tuft of herbs. In a world where resources are scarce, the goat creates calories out of nothing. The sheep, while less adventurous than the goat, brings a different but equally vital asset to the refugee family: the heavy, oily fleece of winter warmth. The winters in the mountains are biting and damp, far colder than the mild seasons of the coast. Survival depends on insulation. The sheep provides the raw material for the heavy cloaks that become the uniform of the era. This wool is not the soft, processed merino of modern times. It is thick, coarse, and rich in lanolin, the natural grease of the animal. When woven into a tight fabric, it becomes nearly waterproof. A shepherd wrapped in such a cloak can sleep out in the rain and wake up dry. The smell of wet wool, heavy and musky, becomes the scent of safety. The management of these herds creates a new rhythm of life, known as transhumance. It is a wandering existence that runs counter to the settled life of the farmer. While the olive grower must stay by his trees, the shepherd must move. In the summer, when the lower slopes burn brown under the sun, the flocks are driven up to the highest alpine meadows, where the air is cool and the grass is still green. In the winter, they descend to the sheltered valleys. This movement makes the shepherd a unique figure in the social landscape. He is the eyes and ears of the community, patrolling the edges of the known world. He's often the first to see the dust of an approaching stranger or to spot the smoke of a distant fire. Yet, it is a lonely life. A shepherd might spend weeks with no company but his dog and the stars. To pass the lonely hours, and to make sense of a world governed by chance, the shepherds develop a peculiar fascination with the bones of their flock, specifically the ankle bone of the sheep or goat, the astragalus. This small knobbly bone has 4 distinct sides, each with a different shape. When thrown on the ground, it lands on one of these sides with a satisfying click. These bones become the original dice. In the quiet of the high pastures, shepherds play endless games of chance with them. But they are more than toys. In a time when the future is opaque and terrifying, these bones serve as tools of divination. A handful of astragaloi is cast onto a flat stone, and the pattern they form is read as a message from the gods. Will the winter be harsh? Will the raiders return? The answer lies in the tumble of the bleached bones. It is a quirky fringe detail of history that the random roll of a sheep's knuckle becomes the way people try to impose order on their chaotic lives. Historians still argue about the primary driver behind this massive shift from cattle to caprines, goats and sheep. Was it purely environmental, a result of a drying climate that killed the pasturelings? Or was it a strategic security choice? A herd of cows is slow and hard to hide. If an army marches through, they can sweep up 1,000 head of cattle in an afternoon. But a herd of goats can be scattered into the rocks in minutes. They can be driven up trails where no soldier can follow. Perhaps the goat was chosen not just because it could eat thorns, but because it could run away. The product of these herds that matters most is not actually the meat. In a subsistence economy, killing a healthy animal is a desperate act, done only for feasts or sacrifices. The true value is the milk. But milk in the ancient Mediterranean heat is a ticking time bomb. It spoils within hours. The solution, much like the grape and the grain, is preservation through transformation. The shepherds learn to curdle the milk, separating the solid curds from the liquid whey. They press the curds into woven baskets, squeezing out the moisture and rubbing the result with salt. The cheese that emerges, feta's ancient ancestor, is a hard, salty block of preserved protein. It is durable. A block of cheese can travel in a shepherd's pouch for weeks without spoiling. It is the portable fuel that powers the people of the mountains. The whey, the watery byproduct, is not wasted either. It is fed to the pigs, the third member of the barnyard trio. Pigs are the ultimate recyclers, living on the scraps, the whey and the acorns of the forest floor. They require no shepherding, rooting around the village perimeter until the time comes for the winter slaughter, providing the fat and salt-cured meat that will help the family survive the hungry months. This triad of livestock, sheep, goat and pig, interlocks perfectly with the agricultural cycle. After the grain is harvested, the animals are let into the fields to eat the stubble. Their hooves break up the hard earth, and their manure fertilizes the soil for the next planting. It is a closed loop, a self-sustaining system where nothing is lost. But as the village economy stabilizes around these new rhythms, the terrace farming, the olive pressing, and the herding, a critical bottleneck emerges. The food is being produced. The grain is in the pit, the oil is in the press, and the cheese is curing on the rack. But the domestic infrastructure of the past has been shattered. The great potteries of the palaces, which mass-produce standard, high-quality jars for centuries, are gone. The kiln fires are cold. A farmer stands in his storeroom holding a block of cheese or a skin of wine, and realizes he has nowhere to put it. The old vessels are cracking, and there are no merchants bringing new ones. The food will rot if it cannot be contained. The village needs a container that is cheap, easy to make, and specifically designed for this new, cramped and rugged life. They cannot rely on the delicate, painted vases of the Golden Age. They need something tougher, something born of the local clay and the geometric logic of survival. The crisis of the container is one of those quiet emergencies that history books often overlook. We tend to focus on the fall of kings or the burning of cities, but for the average family living in the shadow of the collapse, the breaking of a good storage jar is a tragedy of almost equal weight. In the old days, pottery was everywhere, cheap, standardized, and mass-produced in the great palace workshops. You could buy a wine jar in Pylos that looked exactly like a wine jar in Mycenae. But when the palaces burned, the factories burned with them. The skilled potters were scattered or killed, and the secrets of the high-temperature kilns were temporarily lost in the smoke. For a generation or two, the pottery of the refugees is rough and hand-formed. It is the work of amateurs, lumpy asymmetrical bowls that wobble on the table and crack if the fire gets too hot. It is the pottery of survival, ugly but functional. But humans have a deep-seated need for order and beauty, even in the darkest of times. As the settlements in the highlands begin to stabilise, a new kind of craftsman emerges from the village population. He is not the factory worker of the past. He is a local specialist, an artist-engineer who sets up his wheel in a shed on the edge of the settlement. This potter looks at the chaotic world around him, the crumbling ruins, the wild scrub, the unpredictable weather, and he decides to create something that is the exact opposite. He decides to create order. The style that emerges in this era is a radical departure from the flowing, naturalistic designs of the Bronze Age. The old Mycenaeans loved to paint octopuses and flowers on their vases, with tentacles and petals swirling in free, organic shapes. But the new potter rejects this wildness. He turns to the one thing that remains constant when civilizations fall: geometry. This period sees the birth of what archaeologists call the proto-geometric style. It is a formidable name, but the concept is simple and deeply soothing. The new vessels are cleaner, sharper, and defined by strict mathematical lines. The chaotic octopus is gone. In its place are perfect concentric circles, tight bands of black glaze, and sharp triangles. The secret weapon of this new potter is a piece of technology that seems incredibly simple to us, but was a revelation at the time: the multiple brush compass. Imagine the potter sitting at his wheel. He has thrown a large amphora, a storage jar with two handles, and the clay is spinning rapidly beneath his hands. In the old days, he would have painted freehand. Now he picks up a compass, two wooden legs joined by a pivot. On one leg, he has attached not just one brush, but 3 or 4 small brushes made of horsehair, spaced evenly apart. He plants the pivot point on the shoulder of the spinning pot and lowers the brushes. Zip! In a single second, he creates a set of 3 perfect, identical concentric circles. They are flawless. No human hand could paint them so steadily. It is the machine age entering the art world. There is something profoundly psychological about these circles. Historians still argue whether these geometric designs were purely decorative, a way to cover space quickly, or if they held a deeper symbolic meaning. Some scholars suggest that in a world that felt broken and disordered, these perfect, unbreakable circles represented the sun, the cycle of the seasons, or perhaps just a desperate human wish for control. By wrapping their food in geometry, were they trying to impose logic on a chaotic universe? The functionality of these pots also shifts to match the new reality. The clay itself is prepared with more care. The potter mixes the raw river clay with grog, finely ground shards of old, broken pottery. This is a quirky, circular economy of the workshop. The failures of the past are crushed up to give strength to the vessels of the future. The grog acts as a stabilizer, preventing the new pot from shrinking and cracking as it dries. It makes the vessel tougher, more resistant to the thermal shock of daily use. The shapes become tighter and more vertical. In the crowded houses of the refuge settlements, floor space is precious. You cannot have wide, sprawling bowls. You need tall, slender jars that can be packed together like soldiers in a rank. The necks of the jars become narrower, easier to seal with a clay stopper or a pine pitch cork to keep out the weevils and the air. Every design choice is driven by the necessity of storage. There is a tactile pleasure in handling these dark age pots. If you were to run your hand over one in a museum today, you would feel the ridges of the wheel, the slight indentation where the compass point rested. They feel substantial. They are not the delicate, eggshell-thin cups of the palace elite. They are heavy, thick-walled safeguards for the family's survival. The firing process, too, undergoes a subtle evolution. To make a pot truly waterproof, it must be fired at a high temperature, turning the clay into a stone-like material. The village potter builds a kiln that is a masterpiece of thermal dynamics, a beehive-shaped oven that draws air in at the bottom and vents it at the top, creating a draft that fans the flames to over 800 degrees Celsius. In the cool evenings of late autumn, the firing of the kiln is a village event. The structure glows red in the dark, humming with heat. The potter watches the colour of the flame through a spy hole, knowing by instinct when the temperature is right. It is a high-stakes gamble. If he misjudges the heat, a month's worth of work can explode into useless shards. But when he opens the kiln the next morning and the pots ring like bells when tapped, the relief is palpable. These new jars are the final link in the chain of agricultural survival. The grain from the hidden pits is brought up in small batches and stored in these jars for daily use. The olive oil and wine are decanted into them, sealed tight against the air. The pantry of the stone house is now lined with these soldiers of clay, their black circles staring out like watchful eyes. But as the pantry fills with grain, oil and wine, the refugees are acutely aware of a nutritional gap. These are all plant products. They provide energy, but they do not build muscle. The herds of goats and pigs outside provide meat, but meat is a fleeting luxury. In the heat of the Mediterranean, a slaughtered pig begins to rot within hours. You cannot eat a whole pig in a day, not even with a large family. The problem is one of time. How do you stretch the life of a single animal across the long, barren months of winter? They cannot freeze the meat. They cannot can it. They must find a way to pause the biological clock of decay, to turn the wet, vulnerable flesh into something as durable as the wood of the olive tree. The answer lies in the chemistry of the sea and the smoke of the hearth. The slaughter of a large animal, like a pig or a fatted goat, is a moment of conflicting emotions in the village. There is the immediate joy of abundance, the promise of a feast that will break the monotony of bread and oil. But shadowing that joy is a frantic urgency. The clock is ticking. In the warm air of the southern Mediterranean, the invisible forces of decay, bacteria and enzymes, begin their work the moment the animal takes its final breath. A family might eat their fill on the first day, but what of the remaining 90% of the meat? To leave it is to waste it, and in this era, waste is a sin punishable by hunger. The preservation of meat is the ultimate test of the ancient chemist. It requires a mastery of two elemental forces, salt and smoke. Salt is the first line of defense. It is not merely a seasoning as we think of it today, but a weapon against rot. The villagers likely source their salt from the coast, where seawater is evaporated in shallow rock pools under the blazing sun. This sea harvest is carried up the mountain trails in heavy sacks, valued almost as highly as the grain itself. The process of salting is brutal and thorough. The meat is butchered into thin strips or manageable blocks. The butcher rubs the coarse white crystals into the red flesh, massaging it deep into the fibres. This is not a gentle dusting, it is an invasion. The salt acts as a desiccant, a drying agent that draws the moisture out of the cells. Bacteria need water to survive and multiply. By removing the water, the salt creates a desert within the meat, a hostile environment where no microbe can live. But salt alone is often not enough, especially for the thicker cuts of muscle. This is where the architecture of the house plays a vital role. In the centre of every main room lies the hearth. It is an open fire, usually without a chimney, the smoke drifting up to filter through the thatched roof or out of small vents in the eaves. To a modern visitor, these houses would feel smoky and irritating to the eyes. But to the ancient farmer, that smoke is a preservative tool. They hang the salted strips of meat high in the rafters, directly above the fire. The smoke, rich in phenols and other chemical compounds from the burning wood, wraps around the meat. It coats the surface, sealing it against insects and adding another layer of antibacterial protection. But more than that, it slowly cooks and dries the flesh, transforming it from soft, perishable muscle into something hard, dark, and durable. This creates a product that is almost unrecognizable as fresh meat. It becomes jerky or ham or sausages encased in cleaned intestines. It is tough, requiring strong teeth and patience to chew, but it is effectively immortal. A piece of smoked pork, properly cured, can hang in the rafters for a year or more. It waits there, suspended in the darkness, a reserve of protein for the days when the snow blocks the door. There is a fascinating regional nuance to this practice. The type of wood burned in the hearth dictates the flavour of the meat. A family burning aromatic juniper or cypress wood will produce meat with a distinct resinous tang. A family burning oak will create a deeper, smokier flavour. In this way, the terroir of the meat, the taste of the place, is literally infused into the food by the fuel of the forest. Historians still argue about the extent of trade in these cured meats. Was this purely a household activity, or were certain villages known for their hams, trading them across the mountains? There is evidence in later texts of specific regions being famous for their salted pork, suggesting that even in the Dark Ages, a reputation for quality could travel further than the meat itself. Among the most ingenious inventions of this period is the sausage. It sounds mundane to us, a staple of the breakfast table or the barbecue, but the sausage is a masterpiece of zero-waste engineering. When an animal is butchered, there are scraps that are too small to salt and hang, the trimmings, the fat, the organ meats. And there are the intestines, the long, hollow tubes of the gut. The ancient butcher cleans the intestines thoroughly, a messy, cold job usually done at the stream, and then stuffs them with the chopped-up scraps, mixed heavily with salt, herbs, and the spices, like coriander or cumin to mask any gamey flavours. The intestine acts as a natural breathable casing. It holds the meat together while allowing it to dry out evenly. The result is a portable high-density food package. A shepherd can carry a coil of sausage in his pouch for days, slicing off a piece whenever he needs strength. It is the original energy bar. There is also a quirky, lesser-known preservation method that relies on the natural bounty of the land. Potting. Sometimes, instead of drying the meat, the villagers cook it slowly in its own fat. They pack the cooked meat into a clay jar and pour the hot rendered fat over it until the meat is completely submerged. As the fat cools, it solidifies into a white, airtight seal. Buried under this layer of lard, the meat is cut off from the oxygen that fuels decay. It is a confits, a technique that survives today in French cuisine, but was born of the desperate need to keep the winter hunger at bay. These preserved meats, salty, smoky and hard, change the way people cook. You cannot simply throw a piece of rock-hard jerky onto a plate. It must be coaxed back to life. It is chopped up and thrown into the stew pot, where it simmers for hours with lentils or beans. The water of the soup rehydrates the meat, softening it, while the salt from the meat seasons the broth. It is a symbiotic cooking method. The soup saves the meat and the meat flavours the soup. But food is not just about survival. It is about society. In a world without restaurants, without markets, and without money spanning, the distribution of this precious meat becomes a powerful political tool. When a large animal is slaughtered, it is rarely eaten by just one family. The sheer volume of fresh meat that must be consumed immediately, the blood, the liver, the heart, creates an opportunity for a gathering. This brings us to the emerging social structure of the Dark Ages. With the kings gone, who decides who eats? The man who owns the biggest herd, or the man who hosts the best feast? The ability to give food away, to invite the neighbours to share in the bounty of a slaughter, becomes the new foundation of power. The feast is not just a party, it is a mechanism of government. In the deepening twilight of the settlement, the smell of roasting meat acts as a summons. It drifts through the narrow alleyways, slipping through the cracks of the stone doors, pulling the men of the village toward the largest house in the centre of the cluster. This is the home of the basileus. In later centuries, this word will come to mean king or emperor, draped in purple and gold. But here, in the grit of the Dark Ages, the basileus is simply the chieftain, or the village headman. He is not a distant god figure on a throne. He is a farmer like everyone else, but with a few more acres of land, a slightly larger herd of goats, and crucially, the ability to host a dinner party. The structure of this society is being rebuilt around the table. With the complex bureaucracy of the palaces gone, the tax collectors, the scribes, the regional governors, governance has become personal. It has shrunk down to the size of a room. The authority of the chieftain does not come from a divine right or a written law. It comes from his ability to feed his neighbours. Step inside the chieftain's hall. It is a long, rectangular room, the direct ancestor of the megaron found in the ruined palaces, but much humbler. The walls are unpainted mud brick or rough stone. The floor is stamped earth. In the centre, the great hearth blazes, sending sparks up toward the soot-blackened rafters. The room is hot, smoky and loud. It is filled with the leading men of the village, the heads of families, the strongest warriors, the most skilled elders. The feast is a boisterous affair. The fresh meat from the slaughter, which could not be salted or smoked in time, is boiling in large bronze cauldrons over the fire. These cauldrons are items of immense prestige. In a world where metal is scarce, owning a large three-legged bronze pot is like owning a luxury car today. It is a statement. It says, "I have the wealth to cook for a multitude." A quirky, almost visceral detail of these feasts involves the tools used to serve the food. Archaeologists have found long bronze flesh hooks, fork-like instruments with multiple prongs that were used to fish chunks of boiled meat out of the bubbling broth. There is a randomness to this. What you pull out of the pot is what you get, though the chieftain always ensures the best cuts find their way to his most loyal supporters. This distribution of food is not a charity, it is a transaction. In the anthropology of the ancient world, this is known as the gift economy. By accepting a plate of roast pork and a cup of wine from the chieftain, the guest is accepting a debt. He is silently promising that when the chieftain needs help to build a new wall to harvest his olives, or to fight off a raid from the next valley, he will be there. The bond of the community is forged in the grease and the wine. The wine flows freely here, mixed with water in a large central bowl called a crater. A servant dips a pitcher into the crater and fills the cups of the guests. As the wine circulates, so does the talk. This is the village parliament. Disputes over land boundaries are settled here, marriages are arranged, and news from the outside world is dissected. The alcohol lowers inhibitions, allowing men to speak their minds, but the ritual of the toast keeps the peace. Historians still argue whether this system was a benevolent form of social security or a coercive protection racket. Did the chieftain protect the village because he cared for them, or did he extract their surplus labour in exchange for just enough food to keep them loyal? It is likely a mix of both. In a dangerous world, the big man offers protection, and the price of protection is obedience. The seating arrangement at the feast is a map of the social hierarchy. The closer you sit to the fire and the chieftain, the higher your status. To be placed below the salt or far from the warmth is a subtle slight, a signal that your standing in the village has slipped. It is a world where every meal is a test of rank. But there is a fringe element to these gatherings that often goes unnoticed. The role of the leftovers. The feast does not end when the men are full. The bones, stripped of their meat, are often gathered and burned in the fire as an offering to the gods. The smoke that rises through the roof is believed to carry the essence of the animal up to the sky, feeding the divine just as the meat fed the mortals. It is a way of including the unseen forces of nature in the circle of reciprocity. If the gods are fed, perhaps they will send rain for the next harvest. Furthermore, the chieftain's role extends beyond just the provider of meat. He is the keeper of the guest friendship, or xenia. If a stranger wanders into the village, a refugee from a fallen city or a travelling smith, it is the chieftain's duty to take him in, feed him, and offer him a bed. This is not just politeness, it is a survival strategy. In a world without hotels or police, you rely on the kindness of strangers to survive travel. By hosting a guest today, the chieftain ensures that he or his sons might be hosted by others in the future. It is a web of mutual obligation that spans the dark, lonely spaces between the settlements. As the night wears on, the atmosphere in the hall shifts. The hunger has been satisfied, the business deals have been struck, and the wine has dulled the sharp edges of the day's labour. The noise of the conversation drops a decibel. The men lean back on their benches, staring into the dying embers of the fire. The physical body is fed, but there is a different kind of hunger that emerges in the quiet. A need for connection to the past. A need to know that their small, hard lives have meaning. They look to the shadows at the edge of the room, or perhaps to a figure seated quietly by the hearth, holding a simple stringed instrument. The time for eating is over. The time for remembering has begun. The chieftain nods to the bard. The hall falls silent, the only sound the crackle of the wood and the wind outside the stone walls. The men are ready to listen, not to a report of grain yields or a plan for a wall, but to something that flows like a river through time. The fire in the centre of the hall has burned down to a bed of glowing orange coals, casting long dancing shadows against the rough stone walls. The heavy breathing of the livestock, kept in the adjacent room for warmth and safety, mingles with the quiet settling of the men on the benches. Into this hush steps the bard. He does not hold a clay tablet or a papyrus scroll. His hands are empty, save for a simple instrument resting against his chest. It is a lyre, perhaps fashioned from the shell of a tortoise with two curved horns of a goat and strings of twisted sheep gut. He plucks a string, a single resonant note that hangs in the smoky air, and begins to chant. To the modern mind, accustomed to the silent authority of the written word, this moment might seem like mere entertainment, a prehistoric concert to pass the time. But in the context of the Dark Ages, this is something far more vital. This is the village library opening its doors. This is the school, the almanac, and the history book all rolled into one living performance. For centuries, the Mycenaean palaces had relied on Linear B, a complex script used by an elite class of scribes. But Linear B was a soulless thing. It was a tool for accountants designed solely to count sheep, measure oil, and tally taxes. It was never used to write love letters, record myths, or preserve the wisdom of the farmer. When the palaces burned, the scribes died or feared, and because the script had no roots in the hearts of the common people, it vanished with the smoke. The Dark Age are to darken effectively because the lights of the administration went out, but the human need to store information did not disappear. It simply changed vessels. It moved from the fragile clay tablet to the resilient human memory. The song the bard sings is not just a tale of heroes fighting on the plains of Troy, though those stories are popular. He weaves in the works and days, a practical manual of survival disguised as poetry. He sings of the stars and the soil, encoding the agricultural calendar into a rhythm that is impossible to forget. When the Pleiades, daughters of Atlas, are rising, begin your harvest, he chants, his foot tapping out the meter, and when they set, begin your ploughing. This is not abstract poetry. It is a set of operating instruction. The rhythm and the melody act as a mnemonic device, a mental scaffolding that allows the bard to hold thousands of lines in his head without dropping a single syllable. For the young men sitting in the shadows, listening with rapt attention, this is how they learn their trade. They learn that when the crane cries from the clouds, it is time to plant the winter wheat. They learn that when the thistle blooms and the cricket chirps in the heat of June, the goats are fattest and the wine is sweetest. The oral tradition turns the landscape into a map of time. The song connects the biological signals of nature, the bird migrations, the flowering of plants, with the necessary tasks of the farm. It is a knowledge system that is reactive and alive, unlike the static lists of the old scribes. There is a fascinating fringe theory among linguists that the very structure of the Greek language changed during this period to accommodate this shift. The language became more rhythmic, more musical, evolving into the perfect vehicle for the hexameter verse of the epic poets. The hardship of the era literally shaped the sound of the spoken word, turning speech into a tool of preservation. As the bard sings, he also preserves the moral and legal code of the society. He tells stories of the Iron Age of man, a time of toil and hardship, contrasting it with the Golden Age of the past. He sings of the importance of treating guests well, of the punishment that befalls those who break their oaths. In a world without written laws or courthouses, these songs serve as the constitution. If a man cheats his neighbour, the bard might weave a cautionary tale about a cheater into his next performance, shaming the offender before the entire community. The song is a mechanism of social control. Historians still argue about the depth of the illiteracy of this period. Was it a total blackout, a time of intellectual poverty, or was it deliberate rejection of a top-down control system? Some scholars suggest that the people of the Dark Ages didn't forget how to write. They simply didn't need to write. Writing was for the tax collector. In a free, localized society of farmers and herdsmen, the spoken word, guaranteed by the reputation of the speaker, was worth more than a mark on a tablet. The atmosphere in the hall is hypnotic. The repetitive strumming of the lyre and the steady cadence of the voice induce a trance-like state. It binds the room together. They breathe in time with the verse. They are no longer just individuals struggling against the rocky soil. They are part of a long, unbroken chain of ancestors who have survived similar struggles. The song tells them, "You're not alone. Your pain has been felt before, and here is how you endure it." The bard's memory is prodigious, but it is also flexible. He can adapt the song to the audience, adding a line here to praise the chieftain's generosity, or removing a section there if the night is growing late. It is a wiki style of history, constantly edited and updated by the community of singers. One curious detail of this oral transmission is how it preserves technology. The bard sings of the shining bronze of the hero's armour and the grey iron of the farmer's axe. He describes the construction of a plough or the forging of a shield in intricate detail. To the modern ear, these long, descriptive passages can seem tedious, but to the ancient listener, they were technical diagrams. By singing about exactly how a shield is made, layer by layer, fold by fold, the bard is safeguarding the technical knowledge of the craft. If the village smith were to die suddenly, the song remains as a blueprint for his apprentice. The fire pops, sending a shower of sparks toward the roof. The bard's voice drops to a whisper as he finishes a passage about the winter constellations. The men sit in silence for a moment, letting the advice sink in. They know now that the star Sirius is approaching its zenith, warning them of the hottest days to come. They know to prepare the threshing floors, but as the song mentions the tools of the harvest, the sharp-toothed sickles and the heavy hoes, the gaze of the listeners shifts. They look away from the bard and toward a figure who has been sitting quietly near the door, his hands stained not with wine or soil but with soot. The bard can sing about the shield and the plough, and the farmer can wield them, but neither can bring them into existence. That power belongs to the man who masters the elements of fire and earth in a way that seems almost magical. He is the one who keeps the village from sliding back into the Stone Age. While the bard deals in the intangible currency of memory and song, the man sitting by the door deals in the hard, unyielding reality of metal. He is the village blacksmith, and in this fragmented world of isolated hill forts and farmsteads, he has become the single most indispensable technician of survival. In the days of the palaces, metalworking was a factory industry hidden away in royal workshops where hundreds of men churned out swords for the army. But now the industry has come down from the citadel and set up shop in a small soot-stained shed on the edge of the village. The smithy is a sensory anomaly in the quiet agricultural life. While the fields smell of earth and thyme, and the olive press smells of fruit and fermentation, the smithy smells of sulphur, charcoal and hot metal. It is a place of violence and transformation. To the farmer who spends his days coaxing plants from the soil with patience, the smith's ability to take a piece of rock and beat it into a shape seems akin to sorcery. This perception of the smith as a wizard or a man apart is a common thread in the tapestry of the time. He is often a figure of mystery, living slightly on the fringe of the social circle. He works with fire, the element of the gods, and he controls forces that would burn another man's hand. In many ancient myths that survive from this era, the smith god is portrayed as physically different, lame or scarred, perhaps reflecting the real-world injuries that came from a lifetime of wrestling with heavy hammers and molten heat. His daily work, however, is not about forging legendary swords for heroes. It is about keeping the village fed. The agricultural cycle is a machine that chews up tools. The rocky soil of the terraces is brutal on equipment. Iron, while harder than bronze, is brittle. Ploughshares snap against hidden boulders. Sickle blades grow dull after weeks of cutting grain. Axes chip against the hard oak of the forest. Without the smith to repair them, the work stops. A broken plough in October means a family cannot plant. A dull axe in November means they cannot cut firewood for the winter. The smith stands between the community and the catastrophic failure of their technology. The economy of the forge is one of intense recycling. In the Dark Ages, there is no waste. When a tool breaks beyond repair, it is not thrown away. The farmer brings the shattered pieces to the smithy, with a reverence usually reserved for religious offerings. The smith takes this scrap, a twisted piece of a knife, a worn-out hoe, and places it into the heart of the charcoal fire. He works the bellows, a pair of leather lungs that wheeze and puff, driving oxygen into the coals until they glow a blinding white hot. He treats the metal like a living thing, heating it until it is plastic and pliable. Then, with the rhythmic clang, clang, clang that rings out across the valley, he hammers the old metal into a new form. This concept of welding by hammer, beating two hot pieces of iron until they fuse at the molecular level, is the core skill of the age. The iron molecules are literally knit together by force. There is a fascinating scholarly debate about the mobility of these craftsmen. Historians still argue whether the smith was a permanent resident of the village, fed and supported by the local chieftain, or if he was a travelling tinker. Did he pack his hammers and anvils onto a donkey and move from village to village, following a circuit? The archaeological evidence, small temporary slag heaps found in the remote areas, suggests that at least some of these metalworkers were itinerant, bringing the magic of the forge to the customer, like a doctor making house calls for sick tools. The relationship between the smith and the farmer is symbiotic but tense. The farmer needs the tool, but the smith holds the monopoly on the means of production. In a world without currency, how do you pay for a new axe head? You pay in calories. The smith does not have time to plough a field or herd goats. He is too busy at the anvil. So the village feeds him. A portion of the grain harvest, a jar of oil, or a leg of pork is set aside for the smith. He eats the food the farmer grows, and the farmer uses the tool the smith makes. It is a perfect closed circle of mutual dependence. One quirk of the smith's trade is the secret chemistry of quenching. The smith knows that if he plunges red-hot iron into water, it becomes very hard but brittle, like glass. If he lets it cool slowly in the air, it remains soft and bendable. The trick is to find the middle ground, to create a tool that is hard enough to hold an edge, but tough enough not to shatter. He might quench the blade in oil, or even, according to some grim legends, in urine or blood, believing that the liquids imparted different spirits to the metal. It was primitive metallurgy, learned through centuries of trial and error, passed down from father to son in the dark of the workshop. The tools that emerge from this smoky shed are distinct from the elegant bronze of the past. They are heavy, dark, and strictly functional. There is no decoration here, no gold inlay. A Dark Age sickle is a grim curved claw designed to rip through stalks of wheat. An iron adze is a heavy wedge for shaping timber. They are the tools of a people who have no time for aesthetics. Yet without the smith, the terrace walls would crumble, the olive trees would go unpruned, and the grain would rot in the field. He is the anchor of the material culture. As the seasons turn, the smith's workload shifts. In the late winter, the forge glows late into the night as he sharpens the ploughs for the spring turning. In the summer, he beats out new sickles for the harvest. He stands there in the heat, wiping sweat from his brow, looking at the pile of repaired tools waiting to be collected. He has done his part. The hardware is ready, the iron is sharp, but a sharp tool is useless if used at the wrong time. The smith can fix the plough, but he cannot tell the farmer when to put it into the ground. In a world where the climate itself seems to be shifting, where the rains are unpredictable, and the old palace calendars have been lost to the fire, how does the farmer know when the moment is right to break the earth? The farmer stands in the pre-dawn chill, his breath misting in the grey light, looking up at the fading canopy of stars. In our modern world, we live by the digital clock and the printed calendar. We know it is time to work because a notification on a screen tells us so. We have divorced our schedules from the physical world outside our windows, but for the refugee farmer in the Highlands, the concept of time is not a grid of numbers on a page. It is a three-dimensional living mechanism that surrounds him. With the collapse of the palaces, the official state calendars vanished. There were no more scribes to announce the new year, no more priests to declare the official start of the planting season based on administrative decree. The village was left with the only clock that can never be destroyed, burned, or lost, the sky itself. This reliance on astronomy is not a mystical pursuit of horoscopes or fortune-telling. It is a rigorous survival-based science. The farmer watches the eastern horizon, waiting for a specific cluster of tiny, twinkling lights to break the surface of the earth just before the sun rises. These are the Pleiades, the Seven Sisters. Their movement is the master gear of the agricultural machine. When the Pleiades rise in the pre-dawn sky of late spring, it is the universal signal to begin the harvest. It is a command written in light. When they set in the late autumn, vanishing below the horizon as the days shorten, it is the absolute deadline to finish the ploughing. To miss the star is to miss the season. If a farmer waits just a few weeks too long, the winter rains will turn his field into a muddy soup, and the seed will rot before it can sprout. This celestial clockwork extends to the heat of the summer. As the harvest ends and the air turns scorching and dry, another star dominates the southern sky. Sirius, the dog star. It is the brightest star in the heavens, burning with a fierce blue-white fire. For the ancient Greeks, its appearance coincided with the hottest, most unbearable days of the year, a period we still call the dog days of summer. To the farmer, Sirius is a warning. It signals the time when the earth is too hard to work, when the heat can kill a man labouring in the open. It is the time to retreat to the shade, to let the fields rest, and to process the grapes. The star dictates the rhythm of rest just as much as the rhythm of work. But the sky is not the only calendar. The earth itself is filled with biological alarms, bioindicators, that trigger specific tasks. The farmer does not need a date to tell him when winter is coming. He listens for the voice of the crane. The migration of the crane is a sonic landmark. When these great birds fly south from the freezing lands of Europe, crossing the Mediterranean to Africa, their high clattering cry echoes off the mountains. It is a haunting sound, and to the farmer, it is the starting gun for the autumn ploughing. The poet Hesiod, preserving the oral tradition of this very age, warns that the cry of the crane bites the heart of the man who has no oxen, for it tells him he's already late. There are smaller, quieter signals too. There is a specific moment in the late spring when the snail, sensing the rising heat of the ground, climbs up the stalks of the plants to seek the cooler air above. To the unobservant, it is just a snail. To the farmer, it is a notification. Stop digging around the vines, the heat is here. When the thistle blooms with its purple flower and the cicada begins its ceaseless shrill song in the pine trees, the calendar says, rest. This is the peak of summer. It is the time to sit in the shade of a rock, drink wine, and let the goats graze. It is a calendar that allows for leisure, dictated by the biology of the landscape. Historians still argue whether this peasant astronomy was a degradation of the precise lunar calendars of the palaces, or if it was actually the original superior knowledge that the palaces had merely appropriated. Some scholars suggest that the breakdown of the state actually reconnected the people with a more accurate, localized sense of time. A palace calendar might decree that it is harvest month, but if the local weather is cold, harvesting is foolish. The stars and the snails, however, do not lie about the actual conditions of the particular valley the farmer inhabits. This system creates a deep psychological bond between the human and the environment. The farmer is not imposing his will on nature. He's reacting to it. He's in a dialogue with the cosmos. When he sees the artichoke flower, he knows the goats are at their fattest and ready for the summer feasts. When the fig tree puts out leaves at the top of its branches, the sea is navigable for the few traders who dare to sail. There is a quirky practical superstition that often accompanies these observations. Many farmers believe that the weather of the first 12 days of the year predicts the weather for the 12 months to follow. They watch the wind and the clouds on those days with obsessive care, building a mental forecast for the entire year. If the third day is rainy, March will be wet. If the fifth day is clear, May will be dry. It is a way of trying to peek around the corner of time to steal a glance at the future. This integration of time and nature extends to the very structure of the workday. Without clocks, the day is measured in lengths of shadow or in the stamina of animals. A morning's ploughing is a unit of time. The time it takes for a team of oxen to become exhausted is a standard measure. The body of the animal becomes the hourglass. As the years of the Dark Ages roll on, this observational knowledge deepens. It becomes a rich tapestry of wisdom passed from father to son, mother to daughter. Cut the wood for the house when the moon is waning, then say, so the sap is low and the timber will not rot. Shear the sheep when the swallow appears. It is a life lived in total synchronization with the spinning of the planet. This shared calendar also binds the community together. When the crane cries, everyone knows it is time to lend their neighbours a hand with the ploughing. When the Pleiades rise, the whole village moves as one to the fields. There is no need for a town crier to announce the schedule. The sky has already spoken. But as the farmer looks at the stars and prepares his equipment, a new challenge awaits him. He has the iron tools from the smith, and he has the timing from the stars. Yet the land he is farming is changing. The high, thin soils of the terraces are safe, but they are limited. To feed a growing population, the village must look back down toward the heavier, richer, and more difficult soils of the lower slopes, soils that broke the wooden ploughs of their ancestors. The light scratch ploughs of the Bronze Age were designed for soft, dry dust. They merely tickled the surface of the earth. But the clay-heavy soils of the foothills are dense, wet and tangled with roots. They offer the promise of immense fertility, but they are locked away behind a barrier of physical resistance. Knowing when to plough is useless if the tool you hold simply bounces off the hard earth. How can the village break open the heavy ground that has defied them for centuries? The final frontier for the refugee farmer is not a distant land, but the ground beneath his feet. For generations, the agriculture of the Mediterranean had been defined by the limitations of wood. The ploughs of the Bronze Age were simple, lightweight tools, essentially pointed sticks dragged behind an ox. They were known as ards or scratch ploughs. They worked perfectly well in the light, sandy soils of the coastal plains, teasing the earth open just enough to receive the seed. But as the populations in the refuge settlements grow and the need for food increases, the farmers look with hungry eyes at the pockets of heavy, rich clay soil in the valley bottoms and the foothills. This soil is a treasure chest of nutrients, capable of producing massive yields of wheat, but it is locked tight. The summer sun bakes the clay into a surface as hard as brick. A wooden plough acts like a toy against this armour. It skitters across the surface or snaps in half if forced. To unlock the wealth of the clay, the village needs a key made of something stronger. The solution arrives from the smoky shed of the blacksmith, heavy and cold in the farmer's hands. It is the iron ploughshare. This is not a large or complex machine. It is simply a heavy wedge-shaped tip of iron, hammered into a socket that fits over the wooden point of the plough, but its impact is revolutionary. Iron has a density and a cutting edge that wood can never match. When the farmer drives this new tool into the heavy soil, it does not bounce off. It bites. It shears through the tough roots of the scrub brush. It shatters the sun-baked crust. It tears the earth open with a visceral, ripping sound. The experience of ploughing changes. It becomes a heavy physical battle. The iron share digs deep, exposing the dark, damp undersoil that has never seen the sun. The smell of this work is distinct. The heavy mineral scent of turned earth, released into the air for the first time in centuries. It is the smell of potential. But this new tool demands a new kind of power. The iron plough is heavier, and the friction of the deep earth is immense. A single family's donkey or a weak ox cannot pull it. This necessity drives the village into a deeper cooperation. Neighbours must pool their resources. They yoke their oxen together, forming teams of 4 or even 6 animals to drag the heavy iron blade through the clay. The fields become a patchwork of shared effort. The man who owns the plough pairs with the man who owns the oxen, and together they break the ground that neither could conquer alone. There is a fascinating rhythmic geometry to how this work is done. Because the heavy plough is difficult to turn around, the farmers adopt a specific pattern. They plough one furrow down the length of the field, turn the oxen in a wide loop and come back in the opposite direction, laying the next furrow right beside the first. This back and forth motion, winding like a snake across the land, is called boustrafine, literally as the ox turns. Here is a quirky, beautiful detail where agriculture bleeds into art. When the Greeks eventually rediscover writing centuries later, they do not write from left to right as we do, nor right to left like the Phoenicians. Initially, they write boustrophodon. The first line of the text reads left to right, and the next line reads right to left, the letters flipping backward to match the direction. The scribe's hand mimics the farmer's plough. The text is a field of words ploughed into the page. With the iron share, the agricultural map of the Dark Ages expands. The villages are no longer confined to the thin soils of the high terraces. They begin to creep back down the slopes, reclaiming the fertile lands that had been abandoned to the wild. The harvest yields skyrocket. The heavy clay, once broken, offers up nutrients that sustain a booming population. The silos are full, the jars are sealed, and the fear of starvation begins to recede. Historians still argue about the chicken and egg nature of this transition. Did the population growth force the invention of better tools, or did the iron plough create the surplus that allowed the population to grow? It is likely a spiral, a feedback loop of iron, earth, and grain that lifted the Greek world out of its slumber. As we stand at the edge of this newly ploughed field, watching the oxen steam in the cool air, we can see the end of the story. The silence of the Dark Ages is breaking. The isolation is ending. The surplus food allows for trade to restart. The iron tools allow for better ships to be built. The oral poetry, preserved by the bards, is about to be written down by the scribes. The people of the refuge settlements, the survivors who fled to the mountains, who learned to eat from the wild oak, who hid their grain in the earth, and who forged their future in the smithy's fire, have done more than just survive. They have adapted. They have stripped away the excesses of the palace age and built a culture that is tougher, simpler, and more resilient. They have planted the seeds of the classical world in the furrows of the iron plough. The sun dips below the western ridges, casting long shadows across the valley. The work is done. The oxen are unyoked, their heavy heads low as they plod back toward the village. The farmer wipes the dirt from his hands, the iron ploughshare cooling in the furrow. He turns toward the settlement, where the first lamps are being lit, little stars of olive oil flickering in the stone windows. He walks home not as a refugee but as a master of his own earth. The sun has finally set over the mountains, leaving only a faint ribbon of purple light clinging to the peaks. The valley below is swallowed by the velvet dark of the ancient night, a darkness so complete and deep that it feels like a heavy, comforting blanket pulled up over the world. The sounds of the day, the ring of the hammer, the cry of the goat, the shout of the harvester, have all faded away, replaced by the rhythmic, soothing chorus of the crickets in the dry grass. In the village, the doors of the stone houses are closed against the chill. Inside, the families settle onto their sleeping platforms, the warmth of the day's fire still radiating from the hearth. The air smells of wood smoke and dried herbs, a scent that speaks of safety and preparation. The jars are full, the roof is sound, the tools are resting. We have walked a long road together tonight. We travelled from the silent, broken ruins of the great palaces, up the steep, winding goat paths to the refuge of the high cliffs. We watched as these resilient people learned to find water in the rock, to coax oil from the tree, and to forge a new life from the red earth of the mountains. We saw them not as victims of a collapse, but as quiet architects of a new beginning. Now it is time to leave them to their rest. They sleep soundly, knowing that they have done the work to endure the night. And just like the seed sleeping in the silo, waiting for the spring, or the ember sleeping under the ash, waiting for the morning breath, life here is safe. It is holding on. It is ready to grow again. Let your own breathing slow down to match the steady, timeless rhythm of this sleeping village. The history is not a burden, it is a reminder that humanity has weathered the longest, darkest nights before. You are part of that same resilient story. The work is done. The world is quiet. You are safe.